The rain had not stopped for 3 days when Emmett Sable finally turned his horse onto the last stretch of road leading into Harlan County. It was the kind of rain that did not fall so much as it inhabited the air itself, a fine, relentless mist that crawled beneath every layer of clothing and settled against the skin like something alive. The year was 1911, and it was the 14th of October, a fact Emmett would remember with absolute precision for the rest of his life, because he had written it that morning in his surveyor's ledger, in his cramped, meticulous hand, the ink bleeding slightly on the damp page as the pen dragged across the paper. October the 14th, a Monday, and the sky had been the color of old pewter since dawn. Emmett Sable was 36 years old and a land assessor employed by the Commonwealth of Kentucky's Office of Revenue. He had held the position for 11 years, inheriting neither the job nor the temperament for it from anyone, but rather arriving at it through a slow, unremarkable accumulation of competence. He was a man who trusted measurements. He trusted property lines, plat maps, the testimony of iron survey stakes driven into the ground decades before his birth. He trusted the tax rolls maintained in county courthouses across the state, and he trusted, above all else, the quiet certainty that every parcel of land in the Commonwealth could be accounted for, weighed, valued, and entered into the public record. That was the work. That was the world as Emmett understood it. Numbers, boundaries, and the law. He had been dispatched to Harlan County to resolve what the Frankfurt office had described in characteristically understated bureaucratic language as a discrepancy. A property in the Eastern Hills, listed on the county rolls as belonging to one Doctor Alton Crawe, had been assessed for tax purposes at a value that bore no rational relationship to its apparent size, use, or condition. The property was listed as 42 acres of improved land with a single institutional structure, classified as a private medical facility. Its assessed value, according to the county tax rolls filed in 1899 and renewed without alteration every year since, was $410 for 42 acres of improved land with a standing institutional building, in a county where even unimproved timber acreage was appraised at no less than $15 per acre. It was an error. It had to be an error, or it was something else. Emmett had seen both over the years and had learned that the difference between an error and a fraud often came down to nothing more than whether anyone was left alive who remembered the original lie. The road into the Eastern Hills was not truly a road at all after the first 10 miles past the town of Everts. It became a logging trail, rutted and narrow, climbing steadily through dense stands of tulip poplar and white oak, whose canopies closed overhead like the vaulting of a cathedral. And then even those trees thinned as the elevation rose, and the soil turned to shale and red clay, and the path became little more than a scar in the hillside where wagons had once passed. Emmett's horse, a rented bay gelding from the livery stable in Harlan, picked its way carefully along the muddy track, its hooves sucking at the ground with each step, and Emmett sat hunched in the saddle, with his oilskin coat pulled tight around his chest and his leather satchel pressed between his body and the pommel of the saddle to keep it dry. Inside the satchel were his surveyor's tools, his compass, his chain, his transit level, and, most importantly, the documents. A certified copy of the Harlan County tax roll for the year 2010, a plat map of the Eastern District drawn in 1887, and a letter of authorization from the Office of Revenue in Frankfurt, bearing the seal of the Commonwealth and instructing all county officials to render him full cooperation. He had been riding for nearly 4 hours when the trees opened and Barrowfield appeared. It sat on a broad, flat shelf of land that had been carved into the side of a hill, the kind of shelf that in this part of Kentucky was either the work of ancient geological forces or of men with dynamite and tremendous ambition. The building itself was 3 stories of dark brick, its walls stained nearly black by decades of coal smoke and damp, its windows tall and narrow and set deep into the masonry like the eye sockets of a skull. A mansard roof of slate tile crowned the structure, its edges broken in several places where tiles had slid free and shattered on the ground below. 2 wings extended from the central block, one to the east and one to the west, forming a shape that from above would have resembled a squat, malformed cross. The east wing appeared to have suffered some kind of structural failure. Its roofline sagged visibly, and several of the upper windows were covered not with glass, but with boards nailed haphazardly across the frames. The west wing was intact, but dark, every window dark. A stone wall, perhaps 4 feet high and topped with iron spikes that had rusted to the color of dried blood, encircled the property. The gate was open. It had been open for some time, judging by the way the ironwork had grown through the ironwork and fused the gate to the stone post in its current position. Beyond the wall, the grounds were an expanse of neglected lawn gone to seed, punctuated by what had once been a formal garden, but now was a dense thicket of wild rose and blackberry cane. A gravel path led from the gate to the front entrance, and along this path, at precise intervals of perhaps 20 feet, stood a row of wooden posts, each about waist height, each bearing a small brass plate. Emmett dismounted and walked to the nearest one. The brass was green with verdigris, but he could make out the engraving, a number, 17. Nothing else. No name, no date, no inscription. Just the number 17. He looked down the row. Each post bore a different number. He counted 12 posts visible from where he stood. The front door of the sanitarium was unlocked. It was a heavy oak door, reinforced with iron bands, and it swung inward with a sound that was less a creak than a long, exhausted exhalation, as though the building itself were breathing out after holding its breath for years. The foyer beyond was a high-ceilinged space floored in black and white marble tile, arranged in a checkerboard pattern. Many of the tiles cracked or missing entirely, exposing the raw wooden subfloor beneath. A reception desk of dark walnut stood against the far wall, its surface buried under a thick layer of dust and plaster debris that had fallen from the ceiling. Behind the desk, mounted on the wall, was a large wooden board with rows of brass hooks, the kind used in hotels and institutions to hold room keys. Most of the hooks were empty. A few still held keys, their leather fobs cracked and curling. The smell was extraordinary. It was not the smell of death, not exactly, but rather the smell of a place where death had been present so long that it had become part of the architecture. Damp stone, mildewed plaster, the faint acrid sweetness of old chemical compounds, ether perhaps, or chloroform, or something less identifiable, something that had seeped into the walls and the floors and the very grain of the wood and would never leave. Emmett stood in the foyer for a long moment, breathing through his mouth, listening to the rain tap against the windows, and felt, for the first time in his professional career, a reluctance to proceed that had nothing to do with the difficulty of the terrain or the complexity of the assessment. He proceeded anyway. That was what he did. The town of Everts, such as it was, consisted of a general store, a post office that doubled as the telegraph station,
a church of indeterminate denomination, and a boarding house operated by a widow named Luella Fenn. It was to the boarding house that Emmett returned that evening, having spent the remainder of the afternoon taking exterior measurements of the Barrowfield property and sketching a rough site plan in his ledger. Mrs. Fenn was a woman of perhaps 60 years, thin and upright, with steel-gray hair pulled back so tightly that it seemed to stretch the skin of her temples, and she moved through her establishment with the practiced efficiency of someone who had long ago decided that conversation was a luxury she could not afford. Emmett sat at the small table in the boarding-house dining room, a room that smelled of lye soap and boiled cabbage and wood smoke, and ate a plate of salt pork and cornbread, while Mrs. Fenn stood at the kitchen doorway, drying a cast-iron skillet with a flour sack cloth, watching him with an expression that was not quite hostile, but was certainly not welcoming. "I'll be working at the Barrowfield property for several days, the sanitarium on the hill." The sound of the cloth against the skillet stopped. He looked up. Mrs. Fenn had not moved, but something in her face had changed, a tightening around the mouth, a slight narrowing of the eyes, as though she were looking at something behind him that she did not want to see. "You're the assessor," she said. It was not a question. "I am." "From Frankfurt?" "Yes." She resumed drying the skillet, but her movements were now slower, more deliberate. "There's nothing up there to assess. Building's been closed going on 7 years. The county rolls still listed as an active property under the ownership of Doctor Alton Crawe. If it's been closed, the classification needs to be amended. That's part of why I'm here." "Dr. Crawe is dead." Emmett set down his fork. "When did he die?" 1904, maybe 05. I don't recall exactly. It was winter. They found him in the East Wing in one of the treatment rooms. Said it was his heart." She said. "You don't believe it was his heart?" Mrs. Fenn hung the skillet on a nail above the stove and turned to face him fully. Her eyes were pale blue, almost colorless, and they held a steadiness that Emmett recognized as the particular kind of courage that belongs to people who have spent their entire lives in places where courage is not a virtue, but a necessity. "Mr. Sable," she said, "I believe Dr. Crawe died, and I believe that was a mercy. What I believe of the manner of it is my own affair. What I'll tell you is this: there were people in this county who were glad of it, and there were people in this county who were afraid even after he was in the ground, and most of those people were the same people." She said nothing more. She left the room. Emmett heard her footsteps on the stairs, measured and unhurried, ascending to the second floor, and then the sound of a door closing firmly, and then silence. The next morning, Emmett rode into the town proper and called upon the county clerk's office in Harlan, a 12-mile ride that took the better part of 2 hours. The clerk was a young man named Virgil Pettit, perhaps 25, with a nervous habit of adjusting his spectacles and a complexion that suggested he spent most of his life indoors among paper and lamplight. "Barrowfield," Pettit repeated, as though the word itself were unfamiliar to him, though his hands had already stopped moving above the filing cabinet, frozen in the act of reaching for a drawer. "Barrowfield. You're asking about Barrowfield." "I'm asking about the tax assessment on file for the property. I need the original assessment from 1899, any amendments, and the deed of ownership."
Pettit adjusted his spectacles. "The records for that property are, well, they're here, of course. Everything's here. But I should tell you, sir, that those files haven't been requested in, I don't know how long. Years. Many years. That's precisely the problem, Mr. Pettit. The clerk disappeared into the back room of the office, a windowless space lined floor to ceiling with wooden shelves, bowing under the weight of leather-bound ledgers and document boxes, and Emmett waited, listening to the sound of the young man rummaging through files, the rustle of old paper, the occasional muttered word. When Pettit returned, he carried a single document box, not large, perhaps the size of a bread loaf, and he set it on the counter between them with the careful reverence of a man handling something he suspected might be dangerous. "This is everything we have on file for the Barrowfield property," he said. "Deed, assessment, and—" He paused. "There's a folder in there that I haven't opened. It was sealed with wax when I first cataloged this section 3 years ago, and I left it sealed because, well, it wasn't my place." "Sealed by whom?" "I couldn't say. The wax is unmarked, no signet, no stamp, just plain black wax." Emmett took the box. As he turned to leave, Pettit spoke again, his voice lower now, almost a whisper, though they were alone in the office. "Mr. Sable, there was a man who came asking about Barrowfield, 6 or 7 years ago, before my time, but my predecessor told me about it. A journalist, I think, from Lexington. He spent a week here, asking questions, visiting the property, and then he left, and no one heard from him again. My predecessor said the man sent a letter some weeks later, asking for copies of certain records to be mailed to him. My predecessor never mailed them." "Why not?" Pettit adjusted his spectacles one final time. "He said he was advised not to." "By whom?" "He didn't say, and I didn't ask. Some questions, Mr. Sable, you learn not to ask around here, not because you're afraid of the answer, but because you're afraid of what happens after you get one." Emmett returned to the boarding house and opened the document box in his room on the second floor, a small, clean space with a single window overlooking the muddy road and the dark line of the hills beyond. He spread the contents across the narrow bed and began to examine them with the methodical precision that was his professional habit. The deed was straightforward. 42 acres in the eastern district of Harlan County, purchased in 1889 by one Doctor Alton Crawe of Richmond, Virginia, from the estate of a deceased timber merchant named Josiah Hale. The purchase price was listed at $1,200, a reasonable sum for unimproved land in the region at that time. The deed was properly witnessed and recorded. The assessment is where things became strange. The original assessment, dated January of 1899, a full 10 years after the purchase, listed the property's improved value at $410. Emmett read this figure twice, then a third time. The sanitarium had been constructed sometime between 1889 and 1895, according to county building permits that were also in the box, meaning that by 1899 the property held a 3-story brick institutional building with 2 wings, a stone perimeter wall, formal grounds, and, according to the building permits, a separate outbuilding described only as a utility structure. The assessed value should have been, at minimum, several $1,000s. $410 was not merely low, it was fictitious. It was a number designed to minimize tax liability to the point of near invisibility, and it had been accepted and renewed without challenge for 12 consecutive years. Someone had been protecting Dr. Crawe, someone with the authority to ensure that the county's own records were never questioned. Then Emmett turned to the sealed folder. He broke the black wax with his thumbnail. It crumbled easily, brittle with age, and inside he found a sheaf of papers, perhaps 40 pages in all, written in a cramped, angular hand that he did not recognize. It was not a journal exactly, nor a ledger. It was something between the two,
a record of transactions written in a kind of shorthand that took Emmett several minutes to begin to decipher. But once he understood the system, the blood drained from his face and the room grew colder, though the small coal stove in the corner still radiated its feeble warmth. The document was a patient ledger, not the kind of patient ledger maintained by a reputable medical institution with names and diagnoses and treatment records, but something else entirely. Each entry was identified only by a number, no names. The numbers corresponded, Emmett realized with a slow, sickening certainty, to the brass plates on the wooden posts in the garden. Emmett returned to Barrowfield the following morning. The rain had stopped, but the sky remained a uniform, featureless gray, and the air was cold and still, and smelled of wet earth and rotting leaves, and something else, something faintly chemical that he had noticed the day before, and that now seemed stronger, more insistent, as though the building were exhaling its history into the mist. He entered through the front door again and stood in the foyer, consulting the rough floor plan he had sketched in his ledger. The patient ledger had referenced treatment rooms, an isolation ward, and in several entries, a space referred to only as the lower preparation room. This last term appeared in the later entries, beginning around 1897, and it seemed to be associated with the more troubling cases, the ones where the estimated timeline was shortest and the payments were largest. The lower preparation room. Lower suggested a basement or cellar, and Emmett had not yet surveyed the building's subterranean level. He had noted during his exterior survey that the ground on the east side of the building sloped downward, revealing a foundation wall of rough-cut limestone with two narrow windows set at ground level, both of them covered with iron grates. A cellar entrance, if one existed, would most likely be accessible from the interior of the east wing. He walked through the ground floor of the east wing. The corridor was long and straight, floored in plain pine boards that groaned beneath his weight, the walls lined with closed doors, each bearing a small brass number plate identical to the ones on the garden posts. Room 1, Room 2, Room 3. He opened several of them. Small, bare cells, each containing an iron bed frame bolted to the floor, a wooden chair, and nothing else. The mattresses were gone. The walls were bare plaster, stained in places with marks that could have been water damage or could have been something else. The windows were barred on the inside. At the end of the corridor, he found a staircase leading down. The stone were narrow, worn smooth in the center by the passage of feet. There was no railing. The walls on either side were raw limestone, damp to the touch, and as Emmett descended, the temperature dropped sharply, from the chill of an unheated building to a true, penetrating cold that seemed to radiate from the stone itself. He carried a kerosene lantern he had brought from the boarding house, and its light threw long, wavering shadows across the walls and the low ceiling above his head. The cellar was larger than he had expected. It extended beneath the full footprint of the east wing, a single long space divided by stone arches into 3 bays. The floor was packed earth, hard and dry despite the damp walls, and the air smelled of lye and something older, something mineral and faintly sweet, a smell that Emmett's mind refused to identify even as his body recognized it and recoiled. The first bay was empty except for a row of wooden shelves along a wall holding glass bottles of various sizes, their labels faded beyond legibility. He picked one up and held it to the lantern light. The glass was brown, the liquid inside dark and viscous. He uncorked it and immediately wished he hadn't. Chloral hydrate. He recognized the smell from his one semester of chemistry at the University of Kentucky years ago in another life. A powerful sedative. There were dozens of bottles, perhaps 50 or 60, lined up with the meticulous orderliness of a pharmacist's shelf. The second bay held equipment, a heavy wooden table, stained dark, with leather straps bolted to its surface at the positions where a person's wrists, ankles, and forehead would rest. A metal tray on a wheeled stand, holding instruments that Emmett could identify, scalpels, forceps, a bone saw, and instruments that he could not. A porcelain basin, large enough to hold a human torso, set into a wooden frame at waist height, with a drain hole at its base that connected to a lead pipe disappearing into the floor. Emmett stood before the table for a long time. He did not touch it. He did not need to. The leather straps told their own story, worn thin and supple by use, darkened by years of contact with human sweat and struggle. The wood of the table itself was scarred with hundreds of fine scratches, the kind made by nail fingers. He moved into the third bay, and there he found the wall. It was a partition of brick, clearly newer than the surrounding limestone, built across what had once been an open archway leading to a space beyond. The mortar between the bricks was a different color than the mortar in the rest of the cellar, lighter, sandier, and the bricks themselves were of a slightly different size, as though they had been sourced from another structure. The wall had been built quickly and without great skill. The courses were not perfectly level, and in several places the mortar had cracked and crumbled, leaving gaps through which a thin, cold draft of air seeped into the cellar. Emmett pressed his face to one of the gaps and held the lantern close. Beyond the wall, he could see nothing but darkness and the faintest suggestion of a space, an open space extending back into the hill. He returned to his horse and retrieved a pry bar from his surveyor's kit, a tool he carried for removing old boundary stakes from frozen ground. Back in the cellar, in the cold and the silence and the chemical stink, he set the lantern on the floor and began to work at the bricks. The mortar gave way easily, too easily. Each brick he removed revealed the next, and within 20 minutes he had opened a hole in the wall large enough to step through. He picked up the lantern and held it before him and looked into the space beyond. It was a room, perhaps 15 feet square, with a low ceiling of rough-hewn timber beams and a floor of packed earth identical to the rest of the cellar, and on the floor, arranged in neat rows like inventory in a warehouse, were wooden crates. Emmett counted them in the lantern light. 14 crates, each approximately 6 feet long, 2 feet wide, and 18 inches deep, each sealed with nails, each bearing on its lid a number written in black paint.
He did not need to open them. He knew what was inside. But he knelt beside the nearest one anyway, because certainty was his profession, because measurement and verification were the only tools he had ever trusted, and because the dead, if no one else, deserved the dignity of being found by someone willing to look. The nails were old, and the wood was soft with age. The lid came away with a sound like a long, slow sigh. Inside, resting on a bed of powdery white calcium powder that had been spread thickly across the bottom of the crate, were human remains. Skeletal, mostly, the flesh long since consumed by the lime and the years, but unmistakably human. The bones were small. The skull was small. The jaw was narrow and fine. This had been a woman, or perhaps a girl not yet fully grown. Beside the skull, tucked into the crook of the cervical vertebrae, as though someone had placed it there with deliberate care, was a small brass plate, identical to the ones in the garden. The number on the plate was 9.
Emmett replaced the lid. He did not open the others. He sat on the cold earth floor with his back against the limestone wall and his lantern burning low, its flame guttering in the draught from the broken wall, and he listened to the silence. And the silence was absolute, and it was the loudest sound he had ever heard. The aftermath of Emmett Sable's discovery at Barrowfield unfolded slowly, as such things always do in places where silence has been the prevailing currency for decades. He rode to Harlan the following morning and sent a telegram to the Office of Revenue in Frankfort, followed by a second telegram to the Office of the Attorney General of the Commonwealth of Kentucky. In precise, dispassionate language, he described the property, the concealed patient ledger, and the contents of the sealed room beneath the east wing. He requested the immediate dispatch of law enforcement and a coroner. It took 11 days for anyone to arrive. During those 11 days, Emmett remained in Everts, and during those 11 days, he experienced what he would later describe in his written deposition to the Attorney General's office as a gradual and systematic withdrawal of cooperation from every person in the community. Mrs. Fenn continued to provide him with meals and a room, but she no longer spoke to him beyond the minimum necessary for the transaction of business. The general store owner, a man named Calder, who had previously been cordial enough, began locking his door when he saw Emmett approach. And on the third day after the telegram was sent, Emmett found a note slipped beneath his door at the boarding house. It was written in pencil on a scrap of brown paper, and it read in block letters, "You have done a cruel thing. Those people were already dead. You have only made the living suffer." He kept the note. He filed it with his other documents. He did not understand it then. He would come to understand it later. When the authorities finally arrived, a deputy attorney general named Howard Marsh, accompanied by 2 state police officers and a coroner from Lexington, the investigation moved with the ponderous, grinding inevitability of institutional machinery set in belated motion. The sealed room was opened fully. All 14 crates were exhumed and examined. The remains were catalogued, measured, photographed. The coroner, a meticulous and weary man named Dr. Emil Sussman, determined that the remains represented 11 women and 3 men, ranging in estimated age from approximately 20 to approximately 65 years. Cause of death could not be determined from skeletal remains alone, but Dr. Sussman noted in his official report that several of the skulls showed evidence of trepanation, the surgical drilling of holes into the cranium, and that the trepanation wounds showed no evidence of healing, meaning the procedures had been performed at or very near the time of death. The garden was excavated next. Over the course of 3 weeks, working in increasingly cold weather as November settled over the hills, a crew of laborers hired from Harlan dug beneath each of the numbered posts. They found remains beneath every one. 137 additional sets of remains were recovered from the garden, bringing the total to 137, exactly matching the number in the patient ledger. 137 people, over the course of 12 years. The legal proceedings that followed were in many ways more disturbing than the discovery itself, because they revealed the architecture of complicity that had made Barrowfield possible. Dr. Alton Crawe was dead and beyond the reach of justice, but the investigation identified 17 individuals, family members of the victims, who had paid Crawe to commit and, in effect, murder their relatives. Of these 17, 9 were still alive in 1911. Arrest warrants were issued for all 9. 3 fled the state before they could be apprehended. 1, a farmer from Bell County who had committed his elderly mother in 1896, was found dead in his barn the morning the warrant was served, hanging from a rafter, a circumstance that the coroner ruled a suicide and that the community accepted without comment. Of the remaining 5, 3 stood trial in Harlan County Circuit Court in the spring of 1912. 2 were convicted of conspiracy to commit murder and sentenced to terms of 12 and 15 years in the state penitentiary at Frankfort. A third was acquitted on the grounds that the prosecution could not prove beyond a reasonable doubt that she had known Barrowfield was anything other than a legitimate medical facility. This was widely regarded as a fiction, but the jury accepted it because the defendant was the widow of a prominent coal operator, and because Harlan County in 1912 was a place where certain fictions were necessary for the maintenance of the social order. The 2 remaining defendants, a brother and sister from Knott County, who had jointly committed their father in 1900 in order to seize control of their timber rights, pleaded guilty to reduced charges of involuntary manslaughter and served 4 years each. The investigation also revealed that the county tax assessor who had filed the original 1899 assessment, a man named Hollis Greer, had received payments from Dr. Crawe totaling some $600 over a period of 5 years for ensuring that the fraudulently low property valuation and no official inquiry was ever directed at the Barrowfield property. Greer had died in 1907, and his estate was found to include, among other assets, a gold pocket watch engraved with the initials AC, which his widow could not explain. The property itself was seized by the Commonwealth and demolished in 1913. The bricks were carted away and used in the construction of a bridge over the Cumberland River, a fact that Emmett learned years later and that struck him as a peculiarly American form of absolution, the quiet recycling of horror into infrastructure. The land reverted to the county and eventually sold to a timber company that clear-cut the hillside in 1920 and moved on. The victims were never identified, not one of them. The patient ledger contained only numbers, and while the entries referenced family members by initials, these proved insufficient for identification in the absence of any corresponding county commitment records, because Dr. Crawe, with the methodical foresight of a man who understood the value of invisibility, had never filed a single commitment order with any court in the Commonwealth. The families who had paid to have their relatives committed had no incentive to come forward, and those who might have recognized the initials in the ledger had either fled, died, or retreated into the silence that had always been the defining characteristic of life in these hills. The remains were buried in a single common grave in an unmarked plot on the outskirts of Harlan, and no marker was placed, and no ceremony was held, and within a generation, the location of the grave itself was forgotten. Emmett Sable completed his assessment of the Barrowfield property on October 29, 1911, 15 days after his arrival. He filed his report with the Office of Revenue in Frankfort on November 12th. The report was 26 pages long and included a revised property valuation, a complete site survey, and a detailed accounting of his findings. In the margin of the final page, in his careful, cramped hand, he wrote a single sentence that was not part of the official record, but that he could not bring himself to omit. The land itself is sound. It is only what we have done upon it that is ruined.
He returned to his regular duties. He assessed properties across the Commonwealth for another 22 years, retiring in 1933 at the age of 58. He never spoke publicly about Barrowfield. He never granted an interview. He never wrote a memoir. When he died in 1941, his personal effects included, among the unremarkable possessions of a quiet and solitary life, a small brass plate bearing the number 9, which he had taken from the crate in the cellar on the day of his discovery,
and which he had carried in his coat pocket every day for the remaining 30 years of his life. His family did not know what it meant. They discarded it with the other oddments of his estate, and it was lost.
There is a particular silence that belongs to places where terrible things have happened and where no one has spoken of them. It is not the silence of peace, nor the silence of absence. It is a heavier thing, a silence with weight and texture, a silence that accumulates over years and decades like sediment at the bottom of a still river, layer upon layer, compressing the truth into something so dense and so deeply buried that it becomes indistinguishable from the earth itself. Barrowfield was such a place, and the hill upon which it stood is quiet now, reforested with second-growth timber, the stumps of the original oaks rotting slowly into the soil, the stone foundation of the sanitarium visible only as a faint rectangular depression in the ground, overgrown with fern and wild ginger. There is no marker, there is no memorial, there is nothing to tell a passing hiker or a wandering hunter that beneath their feet, beneath the leaf litter and the thin, rocky topsoil of eastern Kentucky, 137 people were brought to die by the people who were supposed to love them, and that their deaths were recorded not with names, but with numbers, and that their graves were tended not with flowers, but with silence. And perhaps that is the most durable horror of all, not the act itself, not the killing, not the greed, not the cold bureaucratic machinery of fraud and complicity that made it possible, but the silence that followed, the decades of silence, the generations of silence, the way an entire community can absorb a monstrous truth and hold it unspoken in the marrow of its daily life, passing it from parent to child, not as a story, but as an absence, a room in the house that is never entered, a name that is never spoken. We comfort ourselves with the belief that evil is dramatic, that it announces itself with thunder and fire, that it is recognizable, resistible, that we would know it if we saw it and would have the courage to speak its name. But the truth that Emmett Sable carried in his coat pocket for 30 years in the form of a small brass plate, is that evil is most often quiet. It is clerical. It is transactional. It arrives in the form of a payment received, a document unfiled, a question unasked. It does not require malice in every heart. It requires only indifference in enough of them. And the earth keeps what we give it. The earth does not judge, does not testify, does not remember in the way that we understand memory. It simply holds. It holds the bones and the brass and the lime and the silence, and it waits with the infinite patience of geological time for someone to kneel in the dirt and look. And when that person finally comes, if that person finally comes, what they find is never the whole truth. It is only the residue, the echo, the faintest impression of a life that was lived and then erased, not by death, which comes for everyone, but by the deliberate act of erasure, which is the unique province of the living. 137 people entered Barrowfield. Not one of them was ever identified. Not one of them has a name that history remembers. They exist now only as numbers on brass plates that have long since been scattered or lost or buried again beneath the patient, indifferent soil. And if there is a lesson in this, it is not a comforting one. It is simply this, that the cruelest thing we do to each other is not the harm itself, but the forgetting, the slow, silent, communal agreement to look away, to let the earth cover what it covers, to let the numbers stand in place of names, to walk the quiet hills and hear nothing,
and to mistake that nothingness for peace.